Someone hears the word cancer, their world often stops. Everything goes quiet, like the sound has been turned off in life. Suddenly, nothing else matters. Dreams pause, plans break, and fear takes over. For many people, cancer feels like the end. Not just the end of health, but the end of joy, of control, of being who they once were. And that's where we meet Sarah, a woman who loved her life, her morning coffee, her garden full of bright flowers, the laughter of her children. One afternoon, she went for a regular checkup, not expecting anything unusual. But the doctor looked serious. Quiet. Then he spoke those life-changing words, "We found something." Just 4 words, but they shook her soul. Sarah had breast cancer. At first, she tried to stay strong, but the fear crept in. She looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize her face anymore, not just because of the illness, but because of the sadness in her eyes. She cried in the shower so no one would hear. She smiled in front of her family, but behind closed doors, she was falling apart. The treatments were painful. Her hair started falling out. She couldn't eat. She felt like giving up. But one morning, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, something small but powerful happened. Her daughter came in, held her hand, and whispered, "Mom, you are my hero." That tiny voice brought a tear to Sarah's eye. In that moment, she realized something important. Maybe she couldn't control the cancer, but she could control her heart, her fight, her spirit. She stood up, slowly, weakly, but with purpose. She wrote 3 words on a sticky note and placed it on the wall. "Still got breath." From then on, that became her daily reminder. Every breath meant another chance. Not a promise of forever, but a reason to keep trying. She joined a support group. There, she met others, like James, who had leukemia and had once tried to push everyone away, thinking it would be easier if they didn't watch him fade. Or Mariam, a young woman who had lost her leg to bone cancer but still came to every meeting with a smile that lit up the whole room. They all had different stories, but the same pain, the same fear, the same silent question, "Will I ever feel whole again?" And together, they found an answer, not in medical charts but in each other. They laughed at silly things. They shared their good days and sat together on the hard ones. They reminded each other that being alive is already a kind of victory. Some days were dark. Some treatments failed. Not every story had a perfect ending. But every person who chose to keep fighting, even with shaking hands and tired eyes, became a quiet warrior. Sarah began to see her scars not as something ugly, but as proof she was still here. She started a journal, writing one thing she was grateful for every day, even if it was just the way the sun touched her window. James began playing guitar again. Mariam started painting with her one hand, and her art was filled with color and hope. These small acts didn't erase the cancer, but they made space for life again, for laughter, for meaning. People around them changed too. Friends who once didn't know what to say learned that just being there was enough. Nurses became family. Strangers became supporters. And slowly, healing came, not just in the body, but in the heart. Sarah is still on her journey. Some days are hard. Some nights bring tears. But she no longer feels alone. She knows now that hope isn't about pretending things are okay. Hope is choosing to take one more breath, one more step, even when you're scared. It's knowing that life can still be beautiful, even when it's hard. And it's believing that your story still matters, even if the ending is unknown. So if you're listening now, and you feel like you're drowning in sadness, in fear, in pain, remember this: you're not alone. Your life is not over. Even if today is full of tears, tomorrow could hold something better. And even if it doesn't, the fact that you are still breathing, still feeling, still hoping, that makes you stronger than you know. Let Sarah's story, and the stories of those who kept fighting, remind you that light can still shine in dark places. that love can still grow in broken soil, and that your life, even with its pain, is still precious, still needed, still worth every moment. At 35, James was a man full of energy, dreams, and stability. He had a decent job, a circle of supportive friends, a small but loving family, and a calm daily routine he appreciated. He wasn't rich, but he had peace. He wasn't famous, but he felt valued. Life made sense to him, until one ordinary afternoon, after weeks of nagging stomach pain. He walked into a clinic and left with 3 words that changed everything: "You have cancer." It was stage 3 stomach cancer. The world around him began to blur. He remembered staring at the doctor's lips as they kept moving, explaining the treatments, the tests, the options, but all he could hear in his head was silence and a sharp echo: cancer. 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 He walked out of the clinic in a daze. That evening, he sat alone in his car for hours, his phone buzzing with missed calls, but he couldn't respond. The first few days after the diagnosis were flooded with concern, messages, prayers, comforting visits. His family cried with him, his friends promised they would stay by his side. And he believed them. He began treatment with hope, believing that even though the journey would be hard, he wouldn't face it alone. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, everything changed. His physical appearance began to change rapidly: weight loss, pale skin, thinning hair. He grew too tired to talk, too nauseated to eat, and too emotionally drained to smile. And slowly, the world began to pull away from him. Friends who once texted daily grew quiet. Calls turned into excuses, then into silence. His workplace replaced him. His family, once filled with energy and promises, began to show discomfort, not out of cruelty, but confusion. They didn't know how to help, so they simply disappeared. Even his partner, the one who once swore to be there, in sickness and in health, began to grow distant, treating James like a fragile reminder of suffering instead of a man fighting for his life. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was the emotional betrayal, the feeling of being abandoned in the middle of a war. People didn't just forget about him, they treated him as if he was already dead. Some laughed behind his back at his appearance, others mocked his weakened state, calling him unlucky, cursed, even weak. He would sit at the window watching life go on. Neighbors walking their dogs, kids playing in yards, cars heading to work, and he felt invisible. Forgotten. Alone. The world had decided his story was over. But James refused to believe that. On one particularly dark night, when he lay curled up in bed trembling with pain, eyes swollen from crying, he whispered out loud, "I'm still here." Those 3 words became his anchor. They weren't loud, they weren't heroic, but they were real. "I'm still here." Every morning after that, he repeated it. Even when his body screamed in pain, even when his reflection terrified him, even when his soul felt empty, he whispered those words. He started journaling, even if his hands trembled. He wrote about his anger, his fear, his loneliness, and eventually, his courage. He joined an online cancer support group and found strangers who became family, people who understood every ache, every scan, every disappointment. With them, he found hope again. James began researching healing foods, breathing exercises, positive thinking, and visualization. He took his medicine, followed every treatment, even on days when it felt pointless. Slowly, day by day, his strength began to grow, not just in his body, but in his will. Nurses began noticing the light in his eyes. Doctors were surprised by how well he was responding. He began walking small steps, then longer ones. His appetite returned. His laughter became genuine. He smiled more. He prayed, meditated, and believed. Then, one day, after nearly 2 years of fighting, his doctor looked at his latest scans and smiled for the first time in a long time. "James," he said, "you're in remission." The words were like a new sunrise. James sat there in silence as tears poured down his face, not because of the pain this time, but because of the freedom, the relief. The joy of surviving what almost destroyed him. But his journey didn't end there. No, that was just the beginning. James had been given a second chance. He didn't want to go back to the life he had before. He wanted to live, truly live. So he began telling his story. First at small support groups. Then at hospitals. Then on podcasts. Then at public events. He shared everything, the pain of diagnosis, the loneliness of abandonment, the cruelty of mockery, the days he wanted to give up, and the quiet strength that saved him. People listened. They cried. They clapped. Some told him, "You gave me hope." Others said, "I thought I was alone." James turned his suffering into service. He wasn't a celebrity, but to those battling in silence, he was a hero. He started a small foundation for men with cancer who were too ashamed to speak up. He visited hospital wards to talk to patients who had no one. He recorded voice messages filled with hope and mailed handwritten notes to those newly diagnosed. He became proof that pain doesn't get the final word. That abandonment doesn't define worth. That healing isn't just about the body, but the heart. Years passed. His hair grew back. His body filled out. He looked like the man he once was, but stronger, wiser, more compassionate. He forgave those who left him. He didn't carry bitterness, because now he knew, suffering had shaped him into someone with purpose. He laughed louder, loved deeper, and lived slower. He celebrated each birthday as if it were his first. Each morning he placed his hand on his chest and whispered, "I'm still here." And whenever someone else received the same 3 words he once did, "You have cancer," James reached out his hand, looked them in the eye, and said with unwavering strength, "You are not alone. You are stronger than you believe. And your story is far from over."